unique back then. Cloud computing, were able to talk about technical architecture. And since it was CRM based as well, and Siebel was all CRM, it kind of made complete logical sense.
That is Karishma Lalwani, a Senior Director of Product Management here at Salesforce. I'm Josh Burke, your host of the Salesforce Developer Podcast, and here on the podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. Today, we sit down with Karishma and talk about scalable architecture. What does that mean on an enterprise level, and what are some takeaways for developers? But we start, as we often do, with her early years here at Salesforce and how she got a certain title.
Group as an architect. So I pretty much got all my certifications and ramped up on the technology within the first 6 months, I would say. Back then, it was like you have to, before being billable on a customer, obviously you need to know the platform.
Right.
So we do a pretty good job of getting architects trained, and surely got into a lot of projects very quickly. And just, I would say 2 years ago, I transitioned from being an architect to being a PM on the other side of Salesforce. So it's been an interesting 8-year journey so far.
Gotcha. Now, before we talk about your current job, tell me why your former colleagues call you the Queen of Encryption.
I hope they still remember me. But the thing was, this was again in 2014, we were rolling out this new pilot product for platform encryption. And I spent a lot of time back then with the product team to make sure that the product is enterprise ready. And because I used to be deployed in these large, complex enterprise customers, their needs were super critical, super important. And if we were able to prove that the product works for one big financial services customer, surely we can have a path from pilot to GA.
Gotcha.
So I almost spent 2 years, I would say, with Asaf, who was the PM back then.
Oh, wow.
And almost like co-creating, getting feedback, real feedback from my customer, and getting the product enterprise ready. And, as part of that, then when you start getting that deep into some technology, you automatically start answering a lot of community questions. And the word spreads around in terms of, okay, this person is the subject matter expert in this area. And that's how the whole Queen of Encryption title came to be.
Gotcha. Okay. I love it. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, because it sounds like you've had a lot of experience, a lot of, with architecture and just big scale kind of thing. I mean, you said you just got into project management, but obviously you're still very centered on architecture. Tell me about your current role and about Frontier Scale team.
So Frontier Scale is a very unique team in our product organization. Essentially, we are a team that works with these largest enterprise customers, some of them who are doing things at a massive scale that we have never seen before. So the intention of the team was, let's see who are these customers who are really, really stretching our platform and, breaking all barriers when it comes to performance and scale. And let's see what would it take to make them successful.
Gotcha.
So as part of my job, I have, it's kind of a dual motivation. One is customer success. So make sure that the customer actually can deploy very complex business processes on our platform. And the second part is product success, which is bring back these use cases from these real enterprise customers back to the product team, be that voice of the customer, and really drive enhancements when it comes to what would it take for a product to scale at that level.
Gotcha. So there's a little bit of outreach and trying to keep the customer safe, but then there's also when it's kind of like are bad, you come back to Salesforce and try to get that fixed.
Exactly. And because we are working with these one-off snowflake use cases, right?
Right.
You learn a lot. You're probably the first one doing something You get some patterns, you get anti-patterns, you get product enhancement requests, and that in turn drives our product to a much more large scale enterprise readiness as well. So I work with almost, I would say, 10 to 12 PMs within our product organization, really
Mm.
getting deeper into the technology stack in core,
Mm-hmm.
understanding where that ceiling is
Mm-hmm.
and what can we do to raise that ceiling even further so that these customers are ready.
Gotcha. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about that specifically, about kind of the core and the architecture around the core. You've described elastic infrastructure, connected platforms, and an always-on experience as something vital to the success of that. So let's walk through those a little bit. Starting the first one, what is elastic infrastructure and how does that help meet demand?
Sure. So when it comes to elastic infrastructure, our enterprise customers have ever growing needs, and sometimes we can't even predict what situations they would end up in.
Mm-hmm.
Customers who are doing global expansions, so they're not just one country but multi-country implementations.
Mm.
They're launching new products, or it could be a merger and acquisition scenario where there is a big company trying to merge with another big company, and what scale challenge would that intake?
Mm.
So when it comes to these, growing need for this auto scale, adding on demand capacity, this is something that is a very, very common use case that we've started seeing.
Gotcha.
It's also to do with seasonality of it. So let's say we have a customer who is a retail customer and they have events like Black Friday,
Oh, yes, yes.
and or you have Intuit who's doing the tax season, right? Those customers have elastic infrastructure needs only for a shorter time period.
Gotcha.
So how do you architect for those key seasonality events, or even generically speaking, when you're trying to look at a merger situation, what would it take for you to scale? So those are some of the use cases that I have spent a lot of time researching, investing, and coming up with the right strategies of how customers should think about it early on so
Mm-hmm.
that they don't have to face any scalability challenges once they go into production.
Got it. Got it. And what are the working parts of a connected?
Connected platform. So, a couple of things. Again, when it comes to these enterprise customers, you're not dealing with one system, you're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with multiple systems, as well as you're dealing with multiple ways the customers use their system. So, it could be today the world is so connected. We have different devices, we have different ways to reach a customer. If I were to put myself as a customer with having, let's say, a cell phone,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm facing some issue, or even let me start early on when I'm just trying to figure out what network should I go with. I possibly start at a website where I'm just browsing different competitor websites and I'm trying to see who's giving me a better rate. That in itself could generate a lead for that specific company to say, hey, there's this person who's trying to look at your pricing and packaging. Why don't you do an outreach?
Mm.
And sure enough, nowadays you will find that even if they get certain pieces of information from you, you will be contacted and you will be
Mm.
asked what your needs are.
Gotcha.
So
Gotcha.
then it means that your profile is now part of that system.
Mm-hmm.
So you started the website, you get a call from the company, you make a sale, let's say over the phone, and then you get an email saying, hello, customer, welcome to so and so network.
Yeah.
That is what I mean by connected platforms. And behind the scenes, there are these huge engines, right? One is a completely different marketing and advertising platform,
Mm-hmm.
which is connected to customers' sales technologies, which could be a sales cloud implementation, which is connected to then service in case I have an issue. And how do
Gotcha.
all of these talk together?
Right. Right. The similarities I'm hearing is kind of freaking me out a little bit because it's like I'm hearing the interview I had with Andrew Lawrence where he was talking about how do you survive the holiday season on
Yeah.
Commerce Cloud, right? And then I think his phrase was something along the line of the new storefront is your phone, right? Like people aren't even going necessarily to their desktop browsers to purchase things anymore. They're just doing it. They're just doing it in their hand. So I think those trends are really interesting. And I also have a callback to Abraham David Lloyd talking about like the digital persona for a B2C architecture and like how do you set all of that kind of stuff. So I love all of that. Tell me a little bit more about being always on when it comes to an enterprise platform.
Yeah. So always on is, something to do with mission critical apps. So let's say there is a 24/7 call center, right? We want to be able to predict any outages in advance and prevent that. So our customer demands are definitely shifting to this always on model, which is basically deploying these business critical, mission critical apps when it comes to customer service.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say if there is like an insurance company who's built their business model on Salesforce. Let's say there is a hurricane that comes in South Florida.
Right.
Suddenly you have a need for people and there's an influx of claims that is coming onto Salesforce.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? If I'm there and I'm looking at my house and I need help, I
Mm-hmm.
need my company to be able to help me. So that is the mindset of having an always on infrastructure. Imagine if at that point you were going to this app and the app said, "Oh, sorry, we are on a 6-hour maintenance window. Please file a claim on 12 p.m." Something like that. So what the
Gotcha.
customer experience looks like in that case.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with government and federal customers. Many a times we have, let's say, the situation right now. Suddenly, we are dealing with vaccinations, and there are state laws that change every hour. And what if California decides to, increase the eligibility, and now it's always on? People just want to go and get their appointments.
Right.
So, how do you manage that sudden surge in the
Mm-hmm.
system
Mm-hmm.
where you anticipate sudden scale? And how do you make sure that your system is able to support that experience?
Gotcha. So there are some of the broad challenges, especially for like, us as a cloud company. But let's flip the perspective around a little bit and talk about the little guy or person, not to genderify, but like the developer in the chair who is going to be working on some of this stuff. Like if I'm a developer, I'm dealing with a large, complicated data structure. What should I be thinking about in order to keep that SOQL performant? Like what are some best practices there?
Absolutely. So if we're talking at a very, very, beginning
Broad.
of the implementation cycle, what
Mm-hmm.
are some of the things that you need to take care, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if I'm a developer, having that performance and scale mindset early on is very critical.
Mm-hmm.
Because oftentimes what happens is we would write a SOQL query example to meet the needs of, let's say, 100 records. But
Right.
we don't know what that same query would do if you inject 1 billion records.
Right.
And if I'm a developer, my sandbox that I play with is pretty small. I don't have
Right.
the ability to even generate 1 billion records and even test
Mm-hmm.
at 1 billion records. So, how do I know that it's never going to work?
Mm-hmm.
And also, when you are in that mode, your priorities, I need to deliver this and I need to deliver this fast because I need to meet a certain deadline.
Mm-hmm.
So then how do we think about scale early on is very critical. And to those people, I would say there are tools that are available today. You have a way to find out what your query path is going to be. You have a way to find
Mm.
out what the cost of the query is going to be.
Mm.
There's very little importance at that point when you're doing a unit test that you would pay attention to, but those
Right.
things are extremely critical when you think about what would it do to the scalability of your application.
Right, right. And I'll keep it short because I know I've given this cautionary tale on the podcast before, but I think back to a customer who shall not be named, who we started designing knowing it was going to, because there was like 3 databases involved or something like that. And we knew even from a Salesforce point of view that once we got to the data, there was going to be a lot of it. And so at some point during the development, I'm like, please give me something that is like your production data. And they gave me something with like 500 rows. And I went back to them like, there's no way we're dealing with give me something that looks like your production data. And they gave me something that had like 5,000 rows. I'm like, okay, whatever. And then we tried to launch and the actual row count was more like 500,000. So performance was suffered
Yes.
a little bit. And actually, let me ask you a question I asked Anil, but putting it into data terms. Like when you say big, when you say, like what is a big data set in your head?
It's very subjective. So
Okay.
there are different ways people look at it. So
Okay.
for me, it's not how much of data do you have resident in Salesforce. You can have up to 500 million records in Salesforce, in your
Okay.
accounts, in your contacts.
Yeah.
That's all okay. It's what you do with that data, how you use it, that becomes more critical.
Okay.
So just 500 million records in an account object sitting there doing nothing does no damage to anybody whatsoever. But let's say now you build a SOQL that's trying to get all the account records with first name John. That is a big problem. So that's why I said it's subjective. It's not to do with how much data is big. It's even with 10 records, if you have a crappy query, guess what? It's not going to scale.
Right. And okay, let me actually ask you on that a little bit. Like, what's something maybe a newbie developer is going to do wrong on a SOQL that could make a 10 query records query not be as fast as it should be?
Not having any filter criteria as part of your where clause.
Okay. For those people who aren't familiar necessarily with like the niceties of database design, why is that?
That is because that would end up doing a full table scan. And you don't know what the dependencies are, how your relationships are mapped. If you're trying to query like a child record and you have a dependent field, then that will do a multiple level. It adds the multiple complexity into that relationship as well. When it comes to data profile, it's very important to know not just what you're doing for that specific object, but how are the relationships built around that as well.
Got it.
So selectivity of the query is extremely important. Not just selectivity, pure database concepts anywhere, not just Salesforce. Make sure you're using indexed fields, right? We all learned that. Make sure you are able to find the record as fast as you can and as correctly as you can.
Right.
So the number of criterias that you add, number of conditions, make it as specific as possible would be the first goal.
Now, I think a lot of developers, and I'm going to kind of include myself in this because I have definitely fallen guilty of the play around a bunch in the developer edition and then try to move something into a sandbox or production and realize that there are strange scenarios that come up. And I have run into this, but I don't know if a lot of developers consider things like row locking and sharing. Like, how do those come into play and when can they become problematic?
That's a very good question. And I would tell you 90% of the customers that we work with where they say, oh my God, our data is not loading or it's loading very slow. Row lock is the number one problem.
Yeah. Doesn't surprise me.
So that goes back to your data profile, right? What are you trying to do with the data? So if it comes to row locks, obviously the very first thing that we recommend is just if you're trying to do a massive data load, just sort the records by the parent ID. Because if there are different records trying to lock the same parent, guess what? It's going to take time. So simple techniques that we have to maximize the parallelism and the load timings that customers can take care of so that the parent child is not being the problem for the row lock. again, coming to sequencing of the data, right? So what are your child entities? How are they referencing the ownership ID or
Mm-hmm.
the parent ID? Which records do you need to load first? Which is reference data versus which is not?
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of things that are very easy to think about and to actually get it in place before you even approach loading of data in Salesforce.
Got it.
And then what was the second thing? I'm trying to recall. You said roll offs and one more.
And sharing.
Sharing. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's a second favorite. Uh, so this is something that's extremely unique to our platform.
Mm,
And me personally, when I started on Salesforce, this is one of the topics that I had to really, really understand a lot more.
mm-hmm.
Anything that you do when it comes to sharing, I've worked with like big banks where, as part of their business use case, they have quarterly account adjustments, which leads to massive role hierarchy changes. And it could be as simple as, your sales organization undergoes a restructuring every quarter. You do different territory mappings. Or even as simple as your employees or your bankers change from one branch to another.
Mm,
And oftentimes we see that customers map all of that as a role hierarchy setup in Salesforce.
mm.
Now, when it comes to massive recalculations like that, guess what? If you do it all at once, and if you've not tested it,
Uh-huh.
chances are users are not going to use your system all weekend, right? I have been in those calls,
Yeah.
and in fact, funny story. I had a once uh, an architect leader in in the customer side, and he said, "You didn't tell me it's going to take 16 hours." I said, "No, what I told you was please test it in a full copy sandbox." And
Yeah.
simple things like these, right? Always test. don't
Yeah.
don't make production your testing ground.
Right.
And
Right.
sharing is so unique, so simple
Yeah.
strategies for that would be, just deferring sharing calculations where it makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
so that again you do your adjustments first and the sharing recalculation happens later asynchronously.
Got it. Got it. And just to clarify, when you say all weekend, you are not exaggerating there.
I was not. If there is one thing you should test, is it has to be any sharing changes that you make, massive sharing changes that you make to your object model.
Gotcha. Gotcha. I'm trying to think of how to frame this question. Like, what does this look like from an Apex point of view? Like, I think every developer has probably heard, like Bulkify code. But what have you seen that's like, maybe I, as a developer, thought I bulkified my code, but I didn't think of X, Y, and Z. Like, what would you tell developers to know about bulkifying their code? But I'm going to try that other verb.
So it starts with even the trigger structure.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just bulkification. Like, yes, bulkify your code is the number one thing that we asked to do. It's just to make it more efficient, right? But let's say you have designed a business process that is doing something on the opportunity object, and you have bulkified your opportunity trigger to insert records. You think as a developer you're the smartest developer, and good job.
Right.
But then there is another admin who's created a workflow on opportunity, and that does some updates too.
Yeah.
And there is a flow that is built by a new person on the team who's again using opportunity as the object.
Mm-hmm.
So now what happens to recursion?
Mm-hmm.
So you might have written the best code for a given situation,
Mm-hmm.
but have you taken a step back and looked broader to see what are the other process automation technologies that you have that Salesforce provides that someone else would have used?
Right. Right.
And so there was this customer that, had, I would say, 2,500 lines of code on one
Mm.
object.
Ugh.
And given a requirement, the developer was very quick to solve it and write 4 more lines, add 5 more lines.
Yeah.
And it took a simple review to show the person what you're trying to do is already done on line 75. So you might want to just use that variable, right?
Oh, when you said that number of code, we're on a podcast, so people couldn't see how much like I actually shivered a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah. Right. So
It's a
how do
little
you manage that technical debt? Like you have
right,
been building for years and years, but are you really doing housekeeping, simple housekeeping
right.
items that lead to apex challenges, right?
Mm-hmm. Because the lean is to always be additive, right? And over time, that's going to just potentially cause more problems.
Absolutely. And then we have some other great technologies when it comes to just from a scale standpoint, not going to the
Yeah,
database for everything, right?
right,
Reuse what you have already queried in your code. Reuse
right,
whatever you're extracting,
right.
or even use platform cache. It's there. It's a product.
Right. I think I'm paraphrasing Anil here when he said something like the best database query you could write is the one you don't have to
Don't
write at
have to
all.
write. Yeah.
Right. Well,
Exactly.
let's talk about one of those similar products. I'm going to confess I have never used big objects. So, like, what are they, and how can developers use them to scale?
Absolutely. So I would tell you what use cases I have seen people use it
Okay. Okay.
successfully. So think of data that you're not really using on a daily basis, but you still have some compliance or regulatory requirements that the data
Mm,
needs to reside on Salesforce.
hmm.
So things like closed investigations or
Gotcha.
cases or accounts that have been terminated, but you need to have a view into them. Records that probably are better suited to have a unified view. So I want to see in the last 5 years how many cases have been raised for a customer.
Mm,
But you don't have to necessarily have all of those records in active storage.
gotcha.
So your compliance group might come back and say, okay, I just need to see 2 years worth of data, but I still need you to hold 5 years for
Hmm.
any queries or inquiries that come from a legal standpoint.
Right.
So then that kind of a situation where you do like archiving strategy or data tiering,
Hmm.
where you have some of it in active storage in your regular custom and standard objects, and then you define a criteria where you push everything else to big objects.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have everything in Salesforce. So guess what? You can build one view to view all
Mm,
of it together.
hmm. And see, I love all of that because I feel like it kind of comes full circle because I assume by pulling them into that, you're also pulling it out of the lake of data. So it can't be a target of my bad SOQL query to begin with, right?
Absolutely. And also you're not doing a lot of data syncing. the
Mm-hmm.
the number one problem, not problem, use case is people want to bring data into Salesforce all the time, and then
Mm-hmm.
they want to delete data from Salesforce all the time. And
Right.
and I'm like, what is your strategy?
Right.
What are you
Right.
trying to do?
Right.
Why bring it if you want to put it back in your backend, right?
Right.
Why don't
Yeah.
you just keep it there and use something like a Salesforce Connect to view it?
Right. Well, and that's why I feel like that deserves a shout out to external objects, which can kind
Yeah.
of sit aside the big object strategy.
Absolutely. And I can't tell you how many number of times I've had these conversations where customers are like, oh, we need to bring everything. But why? Oh no, because we don't want to, go back and forth. But okay, you're bringing it, but are you going to
Right.
use it?
What? Yeah. Right. Exactly. I think my most common question to all of my not the vast majority of people I consulted with was, "Do you really need that?" Like, I know you think you need that, but do you really need that? And can I talk you into a better car, kind of thing?
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
all right. So let's talk about some real world examples. And I know there's some specifics you probably can't get into, but tell me a little bit about Vaccine Cloud and how it presented some unique challenges when it came to architecture.
Absolutely. So that is one of my favorite case studies, right? Because here
Nice.
is a solution where you're trying to do something to millions of people, and you
Mm-hmm.
know that it's going to be a situation where you are going to face maximum concurrency
Mm-hmm.
because everybody wants it and wants it now.
Mm-hmm.
And You can't deny service to anybody. So how do you architect that? So some of the principles for that specific piece, again, it comes to a lot to do with how do you cache entities, how do you manage the flow where you're bringing in people from an experience standpoint, you're bringing them in, you're trying to get some basic information upfront which needs to be more synchronous, but then you have a lot of other things that can be done asynchronous. That way, you're reducing the shortened synchronous activity time, which is holding the database, right? So, how do you think about architecture patterns where you're almost like taking the bare minimum? What are the 5 things I need to know from you to give you an appointment? Okay,
Gotcha.
now that I know, how do I get an appointment? Now that you have an appointment, what are the things that I need to do after you have booked it? So like sending you an email confirmation or text confirmation. How do you decouple those transactions? Not from a experience standpoint, from a user standpoint, it still looks one single flow.
Yeah.
But from an architecture principle standpoint, how do you do it in a way that you don't end up choking the system?
Gotcha. What's your favorite lesson learned from it?
Test.
I'm sensing a theme, by the way.
Yes, scale test is my favorite word. And not because I'm part of the scale team,
Right.
but you know, I've seen customers who, yes, have followed, did the test, went production,
Boom.
were did okay, I would say.
Okay.
But let's say 2 weeks later they wanted to add a new enhancement. Conveniently bypass testing. Right? Because you told me to do it the first time, not the second time.
Right.
And that led to an outage.
Got it. Okay, so design for scale, develop for scale, test for scale. Maybe not even in that order, but always do those things at least.
Absolutely. And it's performance and scale test should not be an afterthought, right? It needs to be handled as part of your design principle.
Okay, so now you also have a project with the wonderful Kelly Walker, a podcast named Designing Architectures on the Customer 360 Platform for Salesforce Architects. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yes. So we are coming up with a 6 mini episode podcast where we are going to go into different topics, all ranging around what would it take for customer architects to design and build on Salesforce platform. So we would be talking about things like integration strategies, including, things like platform events, change data capture, anything that comes to mind from an integration standpoint. We'll have a full episode dedicated to that. We will also be talking about topics like security. What does data security mean to you? What do we do in terms of auditing? How do you protect the data in cloud? And also some exciting new stuff, Hyperforce. So
Hyperforce.
Yes, getting into the technical architecture discussions of what is Hyperforce, what are the use cases, what are the strategies, how do you go about designing and building on a Hyperforce. So it's going to be a lot of different things, I would say. And I'm going to talk to the product managers who own that area to hear it straight from them and just have a little conversation about what they think and we should be doing. And also we are going to source a lot of the questions from the community, so any architects out there, look out for some posts coming up where we will be asking you what is it that you would like to hear on these topics.
And that's our show. Now, that podcast that Karishma is talking about is coming soon, scheduled to come out in August. So keep your ears open for that and keep your eyes out on our social for more information. Now, I did ask after Karishma's favorite non-technical hobby.
Non-technical hobby? I discovered it just during the lockdown. I think a lot of us probably found new hobbies.
Yes, that has come up a lot on the show. Yep, it's true.
Right. So I got into writing, and I
Nice.
didn't know how much I like journaling.
Mm-hmm.
I used to think I'm just good at, putting my thoughts together. But
Mm-hmm.
then I started writing some poetries, and then I started rhyming,
Nice.
and then I was like, oh, this is something that I can build on to. So, yeah, whenever I have some free time, I just
That's
go back
awesome.
to my little scratch pad and start writing.
I want to thank Karishma for the great conversation and information. As always, I want to thank you for listening. Now, if you want to learn more about this show, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes, see the show notes, and have links to your favorite podcast service. Thanks again, everybody, and I'll talk to you next week.